Hi, everybody. This is Professor Alex, and today I will be covering Chapter 3 on culture from the Sociology 3E textbook, which can be found for free on openstacks.com. So I'll be covering, again, culture with you today, and it is kind of interesting because overall it's a pretty straightforward concept. It's just that in sociology, since this is the study of society and social groups, we have more niche topics that we look into when we talk about culture, or we have more definitions that are more semantic based. And you'll see that there'll be a lot of overlap in terms of the concepts that I'm talking about. So don't overthink it. Just roll with me as we go through it. Okay. So first of all, what is society? A society is a group of people who live in a definable geographic area that share a common culture. You cannot have society without culture. And so by culture, I mean like shared beliefs, values, traditions, practices, etc. And so underneath culture, there's a lot of topics, but we're to start with these three, right? So the dominant culture refers to the values, norms, and practices of the elite in society, the wealthy, right? The people who have prestige and privilege and power. So anything that is typically in the US dominant culture refers to like white, middle class, Protestant, European descent type people. When we think about the term professionalism, right? When we think about professionalism, um, the more you meet white, cis, het male standards, the more professional that you are. The more that you can appear like a rich white man, the more professional that you are. In terms of subculture, this is a culture that lives within the dominant culture. It's not questioning or going against the dominant culture. It's just kind of a subculture that has their own kind of values and traditions and practices, right? So, for example, goths, skateboarders, people who watch anime, gamers, certain religious groups, or if you're into punk music versus hip hop music, those things kind of have their own subculture and interests and fashion and everything, right? On the other hand, counterculture is a culture that does directly go against the dominant culture. They are questioning or pushing against the values and beliefs of that of the dominant culture, right? So, for example, the hippies movement in the 1960s. We have freegans, which I suggest you look more into. They essentially like dumpster dive, but not in a gross way that you're thinking about. If you've worked at like Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks or anything like that, you know that at the end of the day, you have to trash all of the perfectly good food. So freegans are the people who kind of go in and dumpster dive for this perfectly preserved food and, eat it or disseminate it because the actual corporation would not allow for that. And I think that's due to them trying to protect themselves regarding health issues, right? Um, Again, really any sort of protest or walkout or a movement that's going for equality is typically going to be against the dominant culture. You think about civil rights activists, people who are in like feminist movements or LGBTQ movements who are pushing for equality and rights for people that under the dominant culture are typically discriminated against or marginalized. So again, any sort of kind of protest or even communes or anyone who's like living in some sort of communal living scenario where they're dependent on each other, they're kind of rejecting the dominant culture and capitalism and kind of doing their own thing and trying to be self dependent in terms of that in their group, right? So again, counterculture is anything that goes against the dominant culture standards, whereas subculture is just something that kind of fits within that might have their own kind of practices. Like I said, society cannot exist without culture. Culture is an intrinsic part of a society, and culture can refer to activities, norms, values, beliefs. This includes language and technology, etc. In terms of like society, usually when we're talking about societies, we're talking about more macro situations, right? Like not micro little societies. Typically, we're talking about, let's say, like the United States or China would be a society, or Western industrialized nations in general would be a society. Looking at, again, zooming out to look at larger societies, this could be a hunter-gatherer society, this could be a horticultural society, agricultural, feudal, pastoral, industrial, democratic. These are, again, these refer to larger ways of life and ways that we can generalize how larger societies function and what their kind of values and traditions are. So again, when we're looking at society, we're really zooming out and looking at the larger kind of aspect of that society. And again, culture is going to make up a big part of that. So when I think about culture in the US, well, it's interesting because I'm from the US, born and raised, all of our norms, values, and traditions and beliefs are very normalized to me, right? That's ingrained in how I think and how I act and how I speak and show up to places, right? But I'm bringing this up because I almost had to Google United States culture because again, it's so normalized to me. It just is what it is for me because this is how I grew up. So you almost have to look from an outside view to understand what is the culture of the United States from the perspective of someone who's not from here. So when I, look it up and whatever in research, or even if you want to look it up on Google or whatever, some of the things that come up a lot are, first of all, individualism. This is something, I won't get into it too deep now, but if you go online and you look up, you can look up a chart on countries based on individualism, right? And the US, last thing I checked, it was #1. But if you were to look now, I would guarantee it'd be in the top 3. And this is from a dichotomy of individualism to communalism. In the US, we are not communal. We value individualism and, you doing it yourself and working hard. And if you work hard, you reap the rewards, and that's all for you because you did that all by yourself, right? We don't really lean on other people in the community other than kind of like symbolically. Another thing that I didn't really think about, but again, people from other countries said these few things, right? Directness. In the US, we tend to be direct in our communication. Informality, a lot of other people from other countries were saying that we tend to be quite informal due to our sense of equality or value of equality. Punctuality, this is something that comes up a lot. Like people talk about the people in the US being in a rush all the time. We're always in a rush. We're always rushing. And being on time is important. And to, to kind of give an example, in undergrad, I largely roomed with my friends, Naz and Kelsey and Jakisha, and they were all from the Caribbean. And it would drive me crazy how slow they walked. I was like, can we hurry it up? Like, why are we walking so slow and so leisurely? And they were like, well, why are you walking so fast? Like, where are you trying to go? And why are you trying to get there so fast? We're gonna get there, right? So in the US, we do have this kind of sense of like rushing, and punctuality is a value that we have. Other things you can think about in terms of culture would be like holidays, Independence Day, Memorial Day, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, President's Day, Halloween, even the Super Bowl Sunday. These are all, holidays that are unique to the US. Some traditions that we have are, Sunday is for relaxing. You're not supposed to work on Sundays for the most part. Another thing is large food portions. We have huge food portions in the US compared to other countries. This one I just found on Google, ice in restaurant drinks. And I'm tripping because I'm like, do other countries not have ice in their restaurant drinks? But again, that's a norm for me. And again, it's so normal being a resident of the US and growing up in this culture that it just seems like a normal thing. But for other countries, it's not. Some other things that we have are like fraternities and sororities. People brought up the fact that we kind of drive everywhere and we don't value kind of like public transit or even like riding on bikes or finding other means to get places. We largely drive everywhere. Yeah, other things are like hugging is very common, and also a lack of vacation days is something that other countries kind of look at us and are like, that's interesting. Y'all don't get any vacation days. Some customs that we might look at are shaking hands. Again, think about other cultures where it might be bowing or kissing on the cheek. Here, you definitely need to have a handshake and it needs to be a strong handshake, right? Another thing we do is tipping service workers. If you don't tip your waiter, that's kind of messed up. But for example, if you're in France, if you try to tip your waiter, they're going to be like, well, what are you doing? Stop. That's weird. And that kind of comes down to the fact that we underpay our servers here in the US, whereas in other countries, they're paid a living wage, and therefore a tip is almost, I don't want to say offensive, but they're typically taken aback and they're like, no, chill. So that's kind of a custom here. Also respecting personal space, baby showers. And I wrote, how are you? And this is specifically referring to the fact that in the US, we say, how are you? And we don't actually mean that. We don't actually want you to tell us how you are, right? Whereas other countries, it might not be such a passing comment, but here in the US, you're just like, hey, how are you? And you can be walking by someone and say, hey, how are you? And you keep walking. You're not expecting them to actually tell you how they are, right? It's to be like, hey, how are you? And they're like, good, how are you? And you're like, good. And you move on, right? So that's something kind of unique to the US where it's a formality, right? It's a custom that we have that other countries might not have. Other things are like food. Um, you know, we have our largest meal of the day, dinner in the evening, and that might be different in other countries. I think that in the US, we kind of have this big uh, culture of dinner where it's supposed to be like this family scenario where you recap your day and you spend time with your family and da da da. And other countries just might do that differently or at different times, etc. Something regional that is kind of important to our culture here in the US is that because the US is so large and diverse, we kind of understand the fact that there are regional differences and influences, and that different regions or even states or groups of people can have kind of their own distinct set of traditions and customs. They all still fit into overall United States culture. And the point is that even these regional differences and specificities are part of US culture. Oh, this is cute. I just found this on Google. Like in terms of clothing, how people view us is that we wear a lot of jeans, sneakers, baseball caps, cowboy hats, and boots. And some brands that are very United States coded are Ralph Lauren, Calvin Klein, Michael Kors, and Victoria's Secret. Another thing that I think is I've always thought is really funny is that in the US we call football soccer, where everywhere else in the world, football is football, right? We're the only country that calls, wait, now I'm getting confused. Wait, hold up. No, yeah, we're the only country that calls football soccer, right? And it's just kind of like again, a unique thing that we do here in the US that definitely does not line up with what the rest of the world does. This is, I would consider this very, very important. And this would be, I'm going to tell you, write this down. This will end up being on your exams and part of some extra credit assignments. So a big, big thing about culture, um, if we were to compare culture to, let's say, like ethnicity or race or anything like that, the big unique part of culture is that it's learned. It is passed down based on communication. We are taught culture. Culture is learned and it is passed down via communication. You can think about symbolic interactionism as a theory as well, talking about how, every interaction has some sort of symbolism and vice versa. Culture is not inherited, right? So for example, my best friend Meg, right? She is adopted from China, but she was adopted from China when she was like 1.5, 2 years old. So technically, her nationality might be, Chinese and whatnot, but her culture is very much American, right? It is very, she grew up, was raised here, and her traditions, cultures, beliefs, and values are that of the United States. So it doesn't matter where you were born. You can technically go anywhere and learn any culture. And again, the opposite with ethnicity is more so heritage, lineage based, really talking about, where you are from in terms of, again, lineage and maybe parents or grandparents or whatever. But again, you can come from anywhere or go anywhere and learn their culture. Culture is learned and it is passed down through generation and through communication. Some examples of culture, like the major aspects of culture, as you can see here, are, organizations, customs, religion, language, government, economy, arts, what we eat and drink, certain skills that we value in our culture, etc. So culture is made up of a bunch of different aspects. I'm not going to cover this today, but I would recommend that you kind of go into this chart in the slides if you have time. I'll cover it in class as well. Race will be brought up when we do the race chapter, but you can see that, like, for example, the big thing is, how do you acquire culture? Like I said, culture is acquired by interaction with close ones, absorbing that through socialization, whereas ethnicity is more so by birth. You don't learn ethnicity, but you can learn culture. You don't practice ethnicity, but you practice culture. Again, culture can be learned, can be passed down, whereas ethnicity, again, is related to commonality based on nation or lineage and ancestry, right? Also, in terms of related to a country, culture is not typically related to a country. It might be related to a certain society, but I wouldn't say I wouldn't just say a country, right? We can get more into that in class, but whereas ethnicity is definitely related to your nationality. Moving on. So going into some other terms that are important when it comes to culture, we have material culture, symbolic culture, non-material culture, and cultural universals. So some examples of these might be, when we talk about material culture, we are talking about something, something's materialistic or material, it's tangible, right? So material culture refers to tangible things. So for example, tools. And by tools, you might even mean like forks, spoons, and knives, like tools and things that we use on a daily basis to help us, not me overthinking it, like tools, any sort of pencils, pens, anything that we might use to just live in society, right? And those tools might be different in different cultures. Technology like cell phone or social media, the clothing that we wear, the toys that we give children, the type of architecture that we have, the type of art that we have, create or value, popular books, what we use for money is different in every culture, right? Even the furniture or interior decorating that we might have is going to be part of our culture. In terms of symbolic culture, you can think of this as kind of sort of the opposite of material culture in terms of it is symbolic and it is not material or tangible, right? This is ways of thinking that includes beliefs, values, assumptions, and behaviors. So for example, what may be symbolic is colors. And by that, I mean like don't overthink it. Like in our culture, like we have different associations with different colors, right? Interesting to me, I'm not sure this is a great example, but in our culture, as of right now, pink usually refers to girls or is symbolic to girly things, whereas when a boy is born, we put them in blue, a girl is born, we put them in pink, right? But it's interesting because about 100, 200 years ago, it was switched. And that was because pink was more expensive and a more difficult color to get, and it was associated with boys. And then I'd have to look into it again, but you can look into it. I think it was 100, 200 years ago where we switched those colors, and now it's girls with pink and boys with blue. But that's the important and interesting part of symbolic interactionism as a theory, is that we're looking at symbolism, and symbolism changes based on context, right? Where you are, what time period you were there, who's perceiving you, who you're talking to, what you're talking about, right? So again, right now, pink symbolizes girls and blue symbolizes boys, but it wasn't always that way. And that's kind of the big thing with symbols, is that they do shift and change throughout time. Other things might be like the fact that we think of doves as like, I don't know, peace. We have, we're very into flags in the US, state flags, nation flags. We like to wear our flags, even though the Constitution says you shouldn't wear the flag. But hey, people do it anyway. Statue of Liberty, that's a symbolic thing. Again, language, gestures, values, customs, music. And a big one is good versus evil. And to kind of give an example of this, and I think this is very purposeful, right? Is that when we think of Black, we think of evil, dark, bad, malice, satanic, right? Whereas we see white and we're like, oh, angelic, pure, good, whatever, right? And I do think that there are some very racist aspects to that, but I digress. When we talk about non-material culture, this is similar, but again, referring to ideas, attitudes, and beliefs that are, again, not material. So again, similar, but language, slang, dress codes, like you're supposed to wear certain things when you go to work or when you go to school or whatever, etiquette in general, laws, punishment, values, ethics. And then what we mean by cultural universals is this is something that is a pattern, or it's something that's acknowledged by all cultures. It's hard to generalize and say all cultures, but in general, cultural universals are cultural aspects that are universal, And by that, I mean, for example, language is universal. The language in different cultures and different societies is going to be different, but language is universal, right? The idea of family is universal. That's going to be practiced differently in different cultures, but family is universal. Death is universal. There's going to be some sort of ritual, practice, or tradition regarding death in every single culture. It's going to be different in every culture, but it's universal. Art, music, dance, these things, again, universal, practiced differently in different cultures, but universal. Same thing with cooking, humor, education, religious beliefs, the way that we greet each other, etc. So when we're talking about a cultural universal, it's the general idea of, let's say, music, but then understanding that every culture is going to have their own interpretation and appreciation and practice when it comes to music. Other types of culture, you're going to get exhausted. There's so many just sub-terms when it comes to culture. But so another way that we talk about culture is kind of high culture versus popular culture. We already talked about subculture and counterculture, so I'm going to skip that. But when we talk about high culture versus popular culture, again, high culture is kind of that of the dominant culture, like we talked about, right? So the dominant culture is again, refers to the values, norms, and practices of the group within society that has the most power and wealth and prestige, right? So when we talk about, when we talk about, I just got lost. When we talk about high culture, we are talking about the culture of the elite in society. Before I go into some other examples, the easiest way to think about this is, well, let me rewind, I guess. So let me not get ahead of myself. So high culture, again, refers to the cultural patterns of the society's elite, whereas popular culture is what is mainstream culture, right? What is widespread and what is literally just popular within our society for the majority of people. So one of the things I think about is that high culture would be owning the basketball team, whereas popular culture would be watching basketball or going to a basketball game, right? And even though going to a basketball game can sometimes be expensive and is sometimes part of being elite, the reality is that you can go to a basketball game, you can go to a baseball game, you can get some nosebleed seats, and you can definitely still go to a game. But high culture would be, oh yeah, I own the Celtics. Oh yeah, I own the Lakers, right? And that would be that's a big difference, right? So other things when I think about high culture is, again, things that are not typically attainable for the general public. And some of these things, you know, you can argue me on, but you'll get the basic idea. So for example, classical music, high culture, opera, high culture, ballet, like the typical people aren't going to operas and ballets, right? That is kind of high culture. Michelin star restaurants. I spelled that wrong. I don't know how to spell it. It doesn't matter. I've been to a Michelin star restaurant because someone took me, but that's not just my day to day to be like, oh yeah, like I just go to Michelin star restaurants. Like, no, like I love a dive bar. Like I love a local pub. Like I love a good pizza joint. You know what I mean? That is popular culture. Going to a Michelin star restaurant, it might be a goal of the popular culture, but it's not popular culture to just be eating at Michelin star restaurants whenever you want. Charity auctions, and by that I mean like I really only see this in movies where it's like rich people auctioning off art, paying millions of dollars for it. Maybe it's going towards charity, whatever. The majority of people in the US aren't going to charity auctions because we're poor, and not just because we're poor, but because there is such a huge wealth gap in between the ultra wealthy and everybody else. Like I kind of talked about in a past lecture, like even doctors and lawyers are part of the proletariat or the working class, right? When we're talking about the bourgeois and the super wealthy, we're talking about the 0.001%, the billionaires, the millionaires. Everybody else is kind of relegated to the working class. And why did I bring that up? I don't remember. It doesn't matter. But again, popular culture. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Let me rewind. Traveling often, I think, is part of high culture. And I mean specifically traveling often, right? Like a lot of us don't ever get to travel. Most of us don't ever get to travel. If you get to travel, that's awesome. There are ways that you can kind of backpack and stay in motels or hostels and be able to travel. Um, so for example, if I want to go to Europe, I might backpack and stay in hostels or motels to kind of travel the area. Whereas again, high culture would be the easy accessibility and the ability to be able to travel a lot and be able to do that in a way where whatever you can stay in hotels or nice hotels or stay on the beach. And again, it's a comfortable, I'm over talking it, it doesn't matter. Designer clothes and bags, this is an interesting one. Like for example, even popular culture is fashion, right? Fashion is a part of high culture and popular culture, right? But the reality is that high culture, that of the elites, that might be getting a Birkin, right? And to get a Birkin, like you need to make an appointment with that store to come in to buy a Birkin, right? And that Birkin is probably going to cost the amount that of a house, right? Like you might be paying 200, 300, 400, $500,000 for a Birkin bag, whereas the rest of us are like, oh my God, I wish I could just have that to put a down payment on a house. And so designer clothes and bags and shoes are a part of popular culture for sure, right? Like we all know Gucci and Chanel and Balenciaga and whatever, but the reality is like I can afford a Gucci belt. Not really, but I can afford a Gucci belt. Let's say it's I think it was like $550, right? It's technically affordable to popular to the masses. You can get one. But again, the normal person in society probably cannot afford a Birkin bag. So just kind of thinking about that, sometimes popular culture will be based off of an influence by high culture, but it doesn't mean that we can necessarily attain what they can attain. This is a random thought, but I'm thinking about there was someone at like a red carpet recently who had like a $500,000 bag and it was made out of ice and it melted by the end of the night, right? So high culture would be going onto a red carpet with your bag made out of ice that's worth $500,000 that is about to melt in the next few hours. Whereas popular culture, again, we like our designer stuff, but we're not getting a bag made out of ice for $500,000. I digress. Some other examples would be that like high culture and popular culture, we're into cars, right? We all like cars. But let's say that you are, you know, of the kind of elite bourgeois class, maybe you're looking at Lamborghinis, Bentleys, Ferraris, Bugattis, and Maybach, right? Whereas popular culture, we still love cars, but it's more so likely to be like a Jeep or a Mini Cooper or a Honda Accord or a Volkswagen or even a Tesla, right? Um, I don't know how much a G-Wagon costs. I don't know if that would be high culture or popular culture. Whatever. There's definitely some like nicer cars that, you know, you can get. But again, high culture is to be cars that cost like a house or like, you know, $1 million or plus. I'm not a car head, so I don't know, but y'all get the gist. Like even a Tesla, like I think of that as like a really nice car that is outside of my means, but I know that that is very much a popular culture car. Whereas, ooh, what's that like new truck that came out that's like psychotic looking? I forget. I'd be curious what you think about if that would be popular culture or high culture. What is that truck? It's that weird like futuristic space car. It doesn't matter. I digress. Whatever. The point is that we can have similar interests in popular culture and high culture, but that there is a very different level of affordability and accessibility to high culture. Moving on, these terms are incredibly important: ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. I've definitely talked about these in class, but I'll do a quick recap. Ethnocentrism, if you just take the word apart, centering your own ethnicity as the best or the right way or as the top of a hierarchy when comparing to other places. So that is evaluating other cultures within the standards of your own culture. Whereas cultural relativism is the opposite, where we are appreciating cultures, values, traditions, beliefs, whatever, in respect to their own culture. We're not trying to compare it to ours or say that ours better or whoever or someone's doing it right. It's being able to look at other people's, other cultures, values and practices and traditions and being like, oh, that's really cool. And I'm not going to judge that on the basis of my own understanding and of the own culture that I grew up in, right? So really I can kind of think of cultural relativism as cultural appreciation. And again, doing away with the comparison and hierarchy of cultures. Cultural imperialism, this one is kind of like, it's kind of similar to like Americanization or colonialism or whatever, but it's essentially when we push our cultural values onto other cultures and again act like ours are better or the right way. So one of the big things when you look this up is like the commodification and marketing of certain cultures and kind of like trying to absorb that into the larger culture. So for example, like Americanization refers to exporting American film, music, clothes, and food to other countries, which then threaten to replace local products or alter slash extinguish features of that culture's way of life. So the first thing that came to my head was Tom's shoes. I don't know if y'all are too young for this. I don't know if people still wear Toms. They were always ugly. They're still ugly. So whatever. But Tom's, their big selling point was, hey, if you buy a pair of our shoes, we're going to donate a pair of shoes to somewhere in Africa, right? I don't think that they were specific. I think they were like, buy a pair of our shoes and we'll give an African kid a pair of shoes. Like that was their whole marketing plan. And on one hand, like, you know, that white savior aspect, like people felt good about that. Like, oh, let's give to the poor African children. Like there aren't poor people in our own country, but that's cool if you want to give and donate and whatever. But essentially, this whole Tom's marketing situation, it really hurt people, and I hate to say just in Africa, but that's how they referred to it. It really hurt, let's say, people who are shoemakers or clothes makers in Africa. It took away, it literally took away their job, right? They lost a job because we're just sending all these shoes. Yeah, look into it. Look into Tom's. It's interesting because, yeah, sometimes off the bat, it seems like a good idea. But in reality, we're like pushing our stuff onto other people, and that's actually messing with their day-to-day way of life and means of taking care of themselves, right? And again, displacing people who do make shoes in Africa. Um, yeah, yeah, messing with their whole way of life and the way that they make money and can provide a living for themselves. Um, what else do I have here? Yeah, colonization. When we think about colonization, that is fueled by cultural imperialism, which again is just pushing our way of life onto other people in a way that is detrimental to their culture. Other examples of this might be like for example, in the US, like, do we have an official language? I forget if we have an official language because I'm pretty sure the point is that, you can come here and be from whatever culture and whatever language, but let's be so for real. Like, if you don't know English, you're not gonna like thrive in the US. You know what I mean? You're gonna have difficulties because even if you are from another culture, from another country, and we appreciate that, um, you're kind of still forced to learn English if you want to really excel or have like upward mobility in the United States. Another example of cultural imperialism that we don't often think about is the fact that like we have military bases in so many other countries. So many other countries. You know how many countries have military bases here? I'll wait. The answer is none. The answer is none. We would freak out if we had a Russian or a Chinese or literally anywhere. If we had anybody else with a military base in our country, in your backyard, we would be like, what the heck? But we have no problem doing that and occupying other countries. So these are all examples of cultural imperialism. I also think like the push of Christianity, even though we are a free religious country and the whole point was you can come here to practice religious freedom, we still very much push like the Protestant ethic and Christianity in general. Xenocentrism is also an interesting one. I would like to hear y'all's examples of this in class, or if you want to comment an example of xenocentrism, I would appreciate that because I'll be honest, when I first started teaching this, I kind of had a hard time coming up with examples. But now I do feel like I have some examples. I'm going to give you like some of like the textbook and Google examples, then I'm going to tell you a personal example. So when you kind of look it up on the internet, they have these kind of like lighter examples, like, oh, French wine is better than domestic wine, or German beers are higher quality than American beer, or, people in Paris are more fashionable than we are here, or foreign made cars or electronics or clothing are better than American made, or, romanticizing other cultures in general. These examples are kind of light to me. When I think about xenocentrism, I'm just going to give you the scenario. So like I was out to kind of like kick back with some friends last summer, and let me not name drop, but okay, so there was whatever, a bunch of people. And so one of the girls, I don't want to say her name. Okay, let's her name's Sally, right? So Sally is Irish, and she had spent most of the summer in Ireland with her family. And so we were at this kickback, and she was like, "Oh my God, like I hate that I'm back here. I hate being in the US. I wish I could be in Ireland. Like it's better in Ireland. Like it's embarrassing that I'm back here. Like everything's better in Ireland. Da 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 da. The US is so messed up, and Ireland is so much better, and blah 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 blah." Right? And sure, like that's like you can have your opinion, you can value or prefer whatever you want. But I was sitting next to a friend of mine who's African American, and she's like second generation, like her parents immigrated here. And she was like, yeah, cool, like I hear you, but my parents fought really hard to get here and to give me a better life here. And you can have your own opinion and preferences, but I do think that xenocentrism is when you kind of go above and beyond a bit to value other cultures over your own in a way that's this one gets tricky, right? Because there has to be a difference between your preference and your opinion. And Yeah, let me move on because I can't edit these videos, so I can't pause for too long. But so xenocentrism again is just like the belief that another culture is superior to your own, and we can believe that. Like I, I'm trying to think about my own beliefs, but I guess it doesn't matter. Typically what I tell students in terms of like nationalism when they start my class in sociology is that we can love our country, right? And if specifically if you love our country in the United States and you are proud of our country, we need to love it enough to critique it and to push for progress and better things. If we really love our country, then we'll want to improve and be better and go towards progress. But I think xenocentrism is more so like, I don't know, there's more so like a derogatory sense here that may not, I don't know, because on one hand, I do think it's positive to look at other cultures and how they are better than us in other ways. Like it's crazy to be like, oh, we're the best at beer, we're the best at wine, we're the best at clothing. Like that's not realistic. Like every country's would kind of have their thing, right? That they're really good at or something that they produce that is really respected by the rest of the world. I guess for me, when I think about xenocentrism, is again kind of the scenario where my friend Sally was like, "Oh my God, Ireland's so much better. I hate it here. I hate it here." And my other friend is like, "Yeah, that's cool, but like I've my parents fought really hard to get me here." So I don't know, this sort of like derogatory sense, but I'm talking too much about this, so let me move on. Honestly, if you have a better example or like if you've kind of seen this happen, please comment it in the comments so that I can use those in class going forward. Because it that one definitely is a tricky one for me. I think kind of a semantic issue there, but whatever. Values and beliefs, we're familiar with these, right? But what I will say to kind of simplify it is that beliefs develop into values. The first step is a belief, which is, something that people hold to be true or important. And then if there's a pattern of this belief and it is adopted by the larger society, it becomes a value, which would be a cultural standard for discerning what is good or bad or just or right or wrong in a society. So I would think of belief as the first step, and then kind of like an institutionalized belief would be a value where we are now absorbing that belief as a value in our larger society. So when I looked up kind of like, and again, it's interesting because, you can reflect on like values and beliefs in the United States, but it's helpful to hear them from another perspective or from people who live somewhere else. So again, like some values and beliefs that we have, when I tried to kind of look at the difference between beliefs and values, again, there's not much of a difference because our beliefs, if popular enough, turn into cultural or societal values. So they tend to be, if you're to look them up, it's going to be pretty much the same thing. So, materialism, individualism, directness, competitiveness, self-help is a big thing here in the US, independence, assertiveness, like I said, kind of being on time, punctuality, accomplishment is a big thing here. We really value accomplishment, right? Like what have you accomplished? What are you up to? What are you doing, right? Um, and I want to say that that's kind of in contrast to there's this group that I follow on Instagram, and they wrote this book called Rest is Radical. And the reality is that, like, here in the US, we really like if you're not doing something, then you're being seen as lazy, right? Like, if you're not working or studying or reading or doing self help or doing something productive, then you are lazy. When in reality, like, rest is good. And in terms of this society, rest is radical because rest is seen as so negative. Where again, I'm following this group on Instagram who's really pushing towards it being common that rest is needed to accomplish things. Rest is needed to be a functioning person in society, and that we do need rest to be successful or not even successful. Like, well, that's another thing is there's a lot of really cool studies on, well, what is success? And again, I've mostly studied this in the US. And there's some very extreme beliefs of like success is like typically people think of success as like monetary gain or like wealth or like privilege or prestige, right? Like something elite, some sort of like wealth, some sort of honor, right? Whereas a lot of people, and this is in the US as well, I'll try to post a link to this study, but there was a study that said a lot of people in the US consider themselves successful if they make it through the day. Successful if you make it through the day, right? They're like, hey, I made it through today, went to work, came back, fed myself, did my laundry. Like that is success. So I think it's interesting because we push this idea of success being this like huge thing that you need to do and achieve. Whereas like the normal person or the average person, the average working class person in the US defines success to be like making it through the day, which is, depressing. We can definitely get into that more in class. But I do believe that, the idea that rest is radical is very real for our society in terms of, God, if you rest, people look down on you, but geez, we need to rest, right? And it's because we live in a capitalist society where it's profit, 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 work, work, work. And if you're not doing that, then you are unsuccessful or you are lazy or whatever, right? So whatever, I digress. But this is something I found ironic when you look up kind of like US values, they say freedom, equality, and diversity. And on one hand, yes. But on the other hand, a little ironic, no? Like we'll say like free for all, like freedom for guns, freedom for this, freedom for that, right? But typically when it comes to certain people like women or queer people or black people or Asian people or indigenous people, not necessarily freedom or equality for them, right? So it is interesting because I saw it come up a lot when I looked at beliefs and values that the US believes and values freedom, equality, and diversity, but I would just argue that I think they value that for certain groups of people is what I digress. But so whatever. I like the important thing is that beliefs are kind of the original thing and that would develop into a value of the culture. Um, Norms, informal norms, formal norms. Norms are like rules of conduct, right? How you should conduct yourself, how you should act in certain scenarios. Informal norms are more casual. You're not going to get punished if you don't follow them, whereas formal norms are established. They're typically written rules that if you do go against them, there will be a punishment of some sort, whether that's like a fine or jail time or banishment. There's going to be some sort of, maybe like, for example, oh, this is a good example, like plagiarism, right? That is a formal norm in academia, or if you're writing anything, like you can't plagiarize. And if you plagiarize, like you're going to lose your degree, or you're going to be debarred, or you're going to not be able to publish again, right? That's a formal norm with a formal sanction to it, a formal punishment to it. So for example, formal norms, like I said, laws, regulations, any rule that is strictly enforced. For example, you cannot steal, you cannot murder, sexual assault, abuse people, or rob a bank. Those are formal norms that if you break them, there is going to be a formal consequence. Informal norms, on the other hand, these forms are enforced, but they're enforced more casually. Like, for example, like let's say like you walk into class and you're like wearing a bathing suit, maybe someone says something, but even if they don't, you're gonna face sanctions in terms of the way people are looking at you. Like, when you're doing something weird and like people might not say anything, but you can feel that they're looking at you and doing an up and down or like a side eye or like a yikes, like that's also sanctions. That's also a way to push people into doing what is normal or right in society, right? So yeah, no one might yell at you for like, wearing a tutu to class. Like, I'm not going to kick you out of class. It's not illegal. It's not bad. But your fellow classmates might look at you like, what are you doing? And at the end of the day, if you're happy wearing your tutu, that's cool. But you are facing informal sanctions in terms of lack of approval by your peers. And for some people, that's enough to stop doing it. And for some people, you can, ignore that and do what you want. But some other examples of informal norms are, when you look someone in the eye, when you're talking to someone, you should look them in the eye. And this is a great example of a cultural norm because, for example, try not to get too personal, but I was friends with someone who was Muslim from Pakistan. And for them, the cultural norm is that if you were talking to someone who is who you respect, who is an elder, again, someone that you respect, you don't make eye contact as a sign of respect. Whereas then you pull that person into a scenario in the US where I'm like, hey, you want to meet my parents? And then they're not making eye contact, and my parents are like, wow, they're so rude. And I'm like, yeah, it's rude here, but in their culture, it's like a sign of respect. But here it's the opposite. It's a sign of disrespect. So again, we think of looking at someone in the eye while talking as a norm, but again, that's not a norm for every culture. Also, you should tip at a restaurant, shaking hands after a sporting event. You need to cover your nose while sneezing. You probably shouldn't litter. You should probably say please and thank you. If you're on a bus and someone who is elderly or pregnant walks on, you should probably give them your seat. You don't want to swear around children. All of these things you're not going to get really punished for. You're not going to get arrested for it or whatever. It's just that people might look at you weird or feel weirdly about you. Yeah. I think we only have just a couple more slides. We're so almost done. But this part is one of the more interesting parts of culture, in my opinion. So we have folkways, mores, and taboos. And it is funny if you Google these things, like I was looking up like specifically trying to find other examples of taboos, and some people were listing things that I would have considered folkway or mores. So I want to say that like in general society, people use these terms interchangeably, and that's okay. But in sociology, we do not. We have a very specific definition for each of these things, and there's a different level of severity for each of these things, going in order from folkway to more to taboo. A folkway is loosely informed, or yeah, a loosely enforced norm that, has to do with our customs and values and traditions, and they ensure a smooth social interaction. That's what I would think about. These ensure smooth social interactions. So, for example, shaking hands when you greet someone, waiting in line, waiting your turn, again, covering your mouth when you sneeze, saying please and thank you, dressing appropriately for work or for class, raising your hand before, speaking, opening a door for someone, or at least holding it open for the person behind you, right? These are all things that help ensure we have smooth social interactions. A more, this one, you can think about more, sounds like moral, right? These are more morally based. These have a moral significance, right? So for example, lying, breaking a promise, cheating, bullying, gossip, drug abuse, vandalism, littering, disrespecting parents or elders. Like these are morally wrong things. You're not necessarily going to go, get arrested for any of these things, but if you do any of these things, you might lose a friendship, right? Like if you're lying and not holding a promise and bullying and cheating and gossiping, it's considered immoral. And although again, you might not get arrested, you might lose a friend or get kicked out of a social group. Whereas taboo, this is the top of the top. This is the highest severity, right? Like you are gonna go to jail for this or be severely punished if caught. And by this, we mean like bestiality, adultery, incest, cannibalism, murder, and rape, right? Like we are talking like when I think about a taboo, I think about something that like you wouldn't want to bring up at the dinner table or really any table, unless you're like having a big moral discussion with your best friends. Like you don't want to be, you're not going to bring up incest or bestiality or rape at the dinner table. Like that's how I think about it. Like if you were to bring it up, people would be like disgusted. Like if we're eating dinner and you bring up cannibalism, I'm gonna be like, you don't even like, why are you bringing that up? That's gross. That's taboo. And that's what we mean by taboo in sociology, where even bringing it up and talking about it is going to have some sort of visceral reaction by people in that particular society. So again, a norm ingrained so deeply that even thinking about violating that for most people evokes a strong feeling of disgust, horror, or revulsion. So when we are talking about taboos, we're talking about something very, very serious and something that like elicits disgust. Whereas again, mores are more so like moral moral errors, whereas a folk way is, again, something that would ensure smooth social interaction. Just a couple more sanctions. I kind of already brought this up lightly. Like, there's different forms of social control and social sanctions. Like, if you think about Mormons, the LDS church, like, if you leave the LDS church, you will be not outcasted, what's the word? Like, you will be banished. Like, you can't come back. Like, okay, you're leaving the Mormon church, cool, go do your thing. Like, you are banished, you cannot come back here, right? Sanctions could also be what I was talking about, where, like, if you wear a tutu to class, you're not going to get kicked out of class, but people might look at you funny. And again, based on your own self confidence or self esteem, you might not care if people look at you funny, but that still is a sanction, right? So positive and negative reactions to the way that people follow or disobey norms, including rewards for conformity and punishment for norm violators. So again, wearing something weird in class, you might get like a weird side eye. But let's say that you wear something like outside of the norm, but like really fashionable and cool. You might get friends who are in class who are like, oh, I really like your shirt, or I really like your fit, or like, where'd you get that? Like, if someone walks in and I really like their fit, I say, oh, where did you get that? I'm going to copy you. That's a sanction. That's me saying, oh yeah, you're doing something right, and I'm giving you praise for it, and I'm telling you that it's okay to do that and to continue doing that, right? So it doesn't have to be verbally like that's wrong or that's right. The way that people react to what you're doing is a sanction, whether positive or negative. You walking around can kind of tell if people are perceiving you positively or negatively, and that is a sanction, right? Whether that's severe or just casual, day to day, or like in court, right? The way that people react to you in society is sanctions, and it kind of pushes you to stay within social norms and to avoid deviance. But again, sanctions are part of social control. These positive and negative sanctions, whether simple or severe, are a part of enforcing and ensuring that you are following social norms. And that is a way to ensure social control. The last one that we have here is symbols and language. And I don't really feel the need to really lecture on this. I think that you should definitely go into YouTube and Google, or go into YouTube, the search bar, and look at symbolic interactionism, and that will get more into this. What I'll say, kind of going backwards, is that language is a system of symbols, right? Like every language, every letter is a symbol, and the way that we put those together can create a language. But the basis of language is symbols. The basis of pretty much everything is symbols, according to a symbolic interactionist, right? And the way that we combine and use those symbols together create meaning. And that's what we mean by symbols, right? Like, it's gestures, language, objects, whatever, that have meaning associated to them. And that meaning, like, symbolism is always going to be contextual, right? For example, like the middle finger in the US, I know that students have told me, like, oh, in other cultures or in other countries, like the kind of idea of the middle finger is different, whether you're doing this or a different finger. Or even there's like, I'm pretty sure someone told me, like, oh, a thumbs up here might be offensive in another culture, right? Just the way that I'm going to stop talking, but essentially symbols are very contextual. They depend on the environment, where you are, when you were there, who's perceiving you, etc. Right? Like, whatever. I don't want to keep you here long. We'll talk about symbolic interactionism more in class. Definitely do go into YouTube and look at some videos on symbolic interactionism. But the point is that, like, every culture has a basis of symbols that create a language that help us communicate with each other. And again, help us kind of enforce different norms, values, and beliefs, and communicate about those norms, values, and beliefs. And again, symbols are going to be contextual. And the other thing about it being contextual is, like, for example, something that was like politically correct 20 years ago may now be seen as like derogatory, whereas something that is politically correct now might be derogatory in the future, or vice versa, right? Like, so for example, when we say like food deserts, right? Like, I teach about food deserts in class when we talk about, social inequality, but I had a well, actually, my boss came in to watch me lecture, and she said, we don't use the word food desert anymore. We use the term Oh my gosh, what was it? Wait. Oh, food apartheid. Yeah. Food apartheid. Yeah. So she had kind of, I was embarrassed because it was my boss, and she was like, "We don't use the word food desert anymore. That's derogatory. It's now food apartheid." So, I learned in class that it was when I was in school, it was food desert, but now it's food apartheid. And I'm not mad about that. I have no resistance to that. I'm just saying that something that you learn that is politically correct or appropriate may eventually become inappropriate and vice versa. Language changes, symbols changes, the way that we dress changes, the way that we communicate changes. Symbols will always be contextual, and will change with time and environment and on who you're talking to and when. But symbols do make up the basics and the basis of the way that we communicate and learn and socialize each other and are socialized ourselves. We'll get more into the semantics and details in class, but I hope that this can kind of give you a basic place to start. And of course, as always, if you have any questions, please, of course, you can either leave a comment in the YouTube video and I will answer that there. You can send me an email or you can send me a DM on Instagram. But either way, I appreciate you all tuning in, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class soon. And if you're not in my class, then I'm happy that you tuned in anyway, and I hope that I could help you with whatever upcoming exam that you have for your sociology class. But okay, everybody, good night. Thank you for tuning in.